Welcome to Oh God, What Now? I'm Dorian Linsky. On Friday's show, we are in the awkward position of wondering if David Cameron, the podcast punching bag who gave us austerity and Brexit, is in fact a good foreign secretary. Is the man who broke Britain now the only competent Tory? In the second half, how important is trust in a democracy and can our institutions get back what they have lost? We'll unpack Ros Taylor's new book, The Future of Trust. And in the extra bit for Patreon supporters, how did cinema bounce back from the existential threat of the pandemic? Following the BAFTAs, we'll discuss some of the movies that have got people out of the house again. Let's meet the panel. First up is journalist for Time magazine, Yasmeen Serhan. Hi, Yasmeen.
Hello.
After we record, the Commons will vote on new calls for a ceasefire in Gaza following a kind of baffling dust-up about which one Speaker Lindsay Hoyle would select and lots of briefing and counter-briefing. I mean, are you left wondering if this is really about Gaza or partisan game playing?
Unfortunately, I think domestic politics has kind of inserted itself. And it's not just here. I think also in the US, you're seeing that there's definitely, a domestic aspect at play where there's concerns. Both countries have elections coming up. There's growing disquiet, I think, over the scale of the carnage that we're seeing in Gaza and, the extent to which our governments are seen to be underwriting them. This is certainly more of a conversation, I think, in the U.S., where, of course, we have a very close relationship and partnership with Israel and send billions of dollars in aid. But yeah, I think politics certainly is inserting itself. And as we're seeing in the Commons, there's all these semantics over, we want a sustainable ceasefire versus we want immediate ceasefire versus we want a temporary ceasefire to lead to an immediate ceasefire. I mean, I would forgive the average Brit for thinking, what is it that you all want? What's going on here? Is this about point scoring or is this about people dying?
Well, also, of course, because this is not like a list of demands that one hands to Benjamin Netanyahu and then that's that. So the wording has to be precise because otherwise you won't do what you want. There is also a sense of like, well, are we arguing about semantics without it actually having any tangible effect? Because they're all like, none of these amendments are going, hooray, go for it. And I wondered whether the language, the Labour leadership's position has shifted. Scottish Labour were very adamant the other day. But, everyone from Joe Biden to the Prince of Wales is in some degree, changed their position or speaking out, particularly around the Israel's planned offensive on Rafah. Why do you think that that's changed after 4 months now? Why is it that the Rafah offensive is the one that seems to have got, pretty much everybody speaking out some way?
Well, because Rafah is literally and figuratively the end of the road for the more than half of Gaza's 2.3 million population. That is where everyone's gone because they were told that that's where it would be safe. Now Israel is saying that this is the last bastion of Hamas, that they need to go in to achieve what Prime Minister Netanyahu calls total victory. But the trouble is, because there's nowhere for these people to go, and certainly, the humanitarian crisis, the situation is just so dire in Rafah. I don't have to bore you. I feel like we've heard a lot of these details kind of over and over again ad nauseum. But, if there was anywhere else for them to go, they probably would have by now. Yeah. There is nowhere left for these people to go. So the prospects of just already nearly 30,000 people have been killed since the start of the war in Gaza. And of course, you have the 1,200 that were killed in Israel. But if the incursion were then to go there, it's just untold what's going to happen. That's not just dying via bombardment or whatever. And there has been bombardment in Rafah already. But, dying of, disease is rampant. The conditions are just horrific. And so I think for a lot of people, it's just prompted a kind of, wait, hang on, this maybe we've seen enough. Maybe this has gone too far. We need to, hit pause, quite literally, and have a think about the long term. Because at the moment, that also hasn't been articulated, neither by the Israeli government or, the U.S. and others have stated their preferred goal for the future. But yeah, and I think that's why you're seeing, not just in the UK and the US and in Buckingham Palace, but, across Europe, with the exception of Hungary, Australia, Canada, New Zealand, everyone seems to be the tipping point. I think Rafah is very much the tipping point.
Next up, it's host of Jam Tomorrow and author Ros Taylor. Hi, Ros.
Hello, Dorian.
Starmer's Chief of Staff Sue Gray has said that Labour will introduce citizens' assemblies to thrash out tricky policies like assisted dying. Now, the idea of getting members of the public involved in lawmaking seems very democratically appealing. People as the show are probably quite keen on the idea. What's the catch?
Yeah, it's a great vibes-based policy, isn't it? Let the people have their say. I'm not entirely convinced by it, to be honest. I think there are a certain number of very discrete, really difficult issues, like assisted dying, like abortion, as the Irish had a citizens' assembly on it, and France as well is having one on end of life, or had one on end of life care last year. And I think in those instances it can be useful. But and most other things, it is not. I mean, a few years ago, France had one on net zero, climate, trade-offs. And look at the country now. I'm not seeing a country that is speaking with one voice about what we should do about the climate and how much we should spend on it. It does sometimes seem to be a substitute for actual informed public debate. It's almost an acknowledgement that we can't have a good public debate about this. So what we're going to do is pluck out 100-odd people and pay them not very much. In France, it was 11 euros an hour, not very much really, to talk about it, and then have a professional write up what they said about it and try and come to a few conclusions. And I just don't necessarily think that's the best way of approaching it. What I would like to see is a more like the belief that we could actually stimulate and inform public debate, perhaps, God forbid, by commissioning, say, the BBC to do a couple of really good documentaries or series on assisted dying, really going into it. And then you might get some great cut through that would enable people to start talking about it, but without this almost sortition kind of approach, which I don't particularly like.
And finally, it's Guardian columnist, author and broadcaster Rafael Behr. Hi, Raf.
Hi, Dorian.
Now, forgive the length of this question. There's a lot's happened. We had a big discussion recently about Kemi Badenoch's leadership chances, but she is having a bad week and a certain pattern is emerging. She accused sacked Post Office Chair Henry Staunton of lying about the sub-postmaster compensation scheme, which Staunton denied. She claimed she was having trade talks with Canada, which the Canadian Embassy denied. She claimed to have received an insulting WhatsApp from Nadine Dorries, which Dorries denied and posted the actual WhatsApp. Plus, she earlier claimed to have met with LGBTQ groups about self-ID, but Ben Bradshaw MP, his Freedom of Information request just came in, and he confirmed that she had only met with 2 groups, both of them anti-trans. So there's documentary evidence in most of these cases. Is Badenoch a bit of a fantasist?
That's a strong word, Dorian, although a bit of, I suppose, leavens it to an extent. Look, I think what's clear is that she has sort of imbibed a certain way of doing politics from the conservative culture of recent years, which I think is pretty much in the shadow of Boris Johnson. So, whether you call it fantasism or, looseness with the truth or not caring about what's exactly true or not, it has that kind of slight Long Johnson element to it. And which I think is also a symptom of the way the Conservative Party has really mistaken public debate for internal party debate, thinking that the Conservative Party is actually where is the be all and end all of what a public discussion is. And you saw that. I mean, otherwise they wouldn't have made Liz Truss Prime Minister, right? I mean, in that contest between Rishi Sunak and Liz Truss, the fact that Truss won so clearly, whereas actually from the outside it seems self-evident she was a sort of preposterous candidate to be Prime Minister. That's a party that's got this kind of arrogance of power and forgets that there's a world out there. So I do think Badenoch is sort of channeling that to a certain extent. I know people who I don't know her personally, but I know people who have advised her and worked with her say she is someone who kind of shoots from the hip. She's quite impulsive, but also she has made a decision or is sort of vulnerable to the logic of thinking you can get profile, you can elevate yourself within the sort of selectorate that will choose the next Conservative leader by being quite pugnacious, by leaning into culture war issues. But she's also Secretary of State, and that involves, and it is technically they are still the government. I think that it's sort of a zombie government now anyway, but they do still have to act and behave responsibly, ideally tell the truth to Parliament. And I'm not sure she's managing that boundary between what you have to do to perform for a Conservative audience and what you ought to do as a responsible cabinet minister.
Well, our own Marie Leconte just wrote a profile for the New European, and she was saying that actually Badenoch is even more ill-prepared to lead an opposition party because she doesn't seem to like people that much, and a lot of people don't seem to like her, and she certainly doesn't like the media. I mean, do you think that her front-runner status is sort of will be dented the more that people see of her, because it seems it's all very well appealing to the base, but it doesn't really seem like that. Perhaps she's got the chops to speak to the people.
I think there are two things here. One is the great paradox of the front runner, which is if you're the front runner for long enough, you by default cease to be the front runner because everyone talks about you so much, you get so overexposed, you end up sort of having your chances sabotaged. Sort of the David Miliband syndrome. The more you're out there as the obvious successor, or or Michael Heseltine, or whoever you want to name. The more you're out there as the obvious person, you cease to be the obvious person. I think there's also another wider thing here, which is that an awful lot of people, a long incumbency promotes people way beyond their natural capabilities in politics, because you just get to rise up, you get to be a junior minister, you get to be a senior minister. A lot of the good people get knocked out by attrition, they resign, and you get really mediocre people given quite big positions in government, and then they think they deserve those positions, they think they're really serious politicians, and they're going to get a massive shock when they're in opposition. They're completely irrelevant, no one cares what they say, no one's listening to what they say. And at the moment she's a Secretary of State, the Conservatives are in government. She's held up, as you say, as this sort of a possible heir to Rishi Sunak, which in her head probably means being a bit like the next prime minister. And then if they get absolutely butchered in the next election, and you're just you're in the William Hague 1998 position, and no one cares, no one's listening, and you're a bit of a joke, that is going to do the ego deflation and the readjustment to that. Is it's not just her, it's a lot of them. I mean, Robert Jenrick, for example. I mean, how quickly is that guy just going to look absurdly irrelevant? Just a hard pub quiz question answer, and that's it. That's nothing. But at the moment, he thinks he's a real player. He's touring America. He's thinking, I could possibly be the next big thing. Jenrick, you're not. You're no one.
I worry that the difficulties of opposition might dent Badenoch's natural warmth. Before we get started, I just want to say a huge thanks to the influx of Patreon backers we've had over the past couple of weeks. Things are getting tight in the podcasting world, with advertising budgets being cut by the man. And unfortunately, we're going to have to rely on you more to keep Oh God What Now in good shape for election year. So we know things are tough out there, but if you can find £3 a month or more, you will be helping us to stay on course. And of course, you'll get our fabulous merchandise and bonus content too. Search Patreon Oh God What Now, or visit the link in the show notes to find out more. When Baron Cameron of Chipping Norton, the artist formerly known as David Cameron, made a surprise return to government as Foreign Secretary last November, there was anger and disbelief. He was no longer an MP, and his record as PM was not solid gold. On this very podcast, we've been less than kind about austerity and Brexit. But in a cabinet of fools and mediocrities, he's the only person who's attracting a considerable degree of acclaim at home and abroad. What has he achieved, and can we ever forgive him? Raf, given the state of the Tories and the fact that he does not have long, why do you think he took the job?
I think partly he wanted to launder his reputation. I mean, the last thing that people, if they remember much, Remainers will remember him as the guy who delivered Brexit. Leavers will remember him as the guy who didn't want to do Brexit. It basically was the last iteration of the worst kind of conservatism. And anyone else who's paying attention will remember the Greensill lobbying scandal, which was really grubby. I mean, it wasn't in pursuit of anything other than just cash. I mean, literally, it was just pure greed on behalf of someone who has plenty of money already, shilling for some financial instrument. I mean, it was just so low grade, as well as being actually pretty grubby from an ethical point of view. So the opportunity to then sort of make the last page on the last paragraph in the Wikipedia page something along the lines of elder statesman did serious foreign policy. I mean, you can see the appeal, right?
Yeah.
So I think that's a large part of it. And also, he was bored. I mean, I think, everyone says, once you've been in those big government jobs, especially prime minister, you're getting briefed by the security services, you're jet setting around the place. It's a pretty fancy gig. And then, you're sitting in your shepherd's hut in Chipping Norton. It's, basically getting calls from lobbyists, whereas foreign secretary, that's actually quite a glamorous gig in terms of the lovely. I mean, I don't think you've ever been in a foreign secretary's office, but it's nicer than the office in number 10 that the prime minister gets. It's a really swanky pad. So I think he's a vain man, and his vanity was very obviously tickled by the idea.
Well, Guardian's Patrick Winter calls him a man in a hurry. He won't be in government this time next year. I mean, has that tight deadline plus vanity made him a more efficient foreign secretary? Like the incentive to actually do something is greater than it is for a lot of people.
I think he genuinely has leeway as well. I mean, clearly, we don't know what the conversation was that Rishi Sunak had with David Cameron, but I doubt Cameron would have done it if he hadn't had very clear assurances, that like, this is your gig, you do it, you run it. I've got an election to fight. Domestic policy is hard enough. we don't get the impression Sunak is very interested in foreign policy. He's certainly not interested in European policy. He's interested in international stuff to the extent that it's, tech bro, West Coast conversations about the world. He did that big AI conference, but geostrategic thinking is not his strong point. So I think, what Cameron is busy because he really is quite an autonomous foreign secretary, which is unusual. I mean, almost every prime minister sort of ends up being their own foreign secretary. I mean, when Boris Johnson did the job, he didn't do any, Theresa May didn't want him to actually do foreign policy. She wanted him to just have a proper job and maybe leave her alone and not undermine her, which he did anyway. But so I think from that point of view, what looks like busyness is actually someone unusually doing the job, with a fair amount of autonomy and effort.
Well, he seems sort of semi-detached from the cabinet because in the context of the post-Brexit Tory party, he's a bit of a centrist softy. I mean, when you're sort of, looking at him, writing about him, does he sort of seem fully part of this government, or does that autonomy sort of extend to, like, I don't know, I just don't see him hanging out with the others.
Yeah, I mean, the thing you have to remember about David Cameron is he is incredibly arrogant. And he has been prime minister. It's very hard to imagine him actually thinking he is subordinate to Rishi Sunak.
Right,
It's very easy to imagine him really patronising Rishi Sunak and thinking, look, okay, so I'm not the prime minister anymore, but I am actually the biggest, most important person in this room right now. And, one of the reasons he was so deeply unpopular with his own party, with large sections of his own party when he was prime minister, is because he treated ordinary Tory MPs like dirty, smelly infantrymen, while he was this sort of immaculately groomed cavalry officer, just completely sort of galloping past, taking the salute, and then going off and having a fine old time and not caring about what was happening in the trenches. So I think, it's very hard to imagine him being completely collegiate, but also he's not going to be in the business of undermining Rishi Sunak. He's not going to say things that Rishi Sunak doesn't necessarily want him to say, because also, having been prime minister, he knows how really fucking annoying that is when people do it.
I had a dream last night that I was bullying Rishi Sunak, and I was like, I can't believe he's letting me get away with this. He's the prime minister. And I don't bully
Did you have
people.
him in a headlock by any chance? You like rubbing the top of his head?
I was just sort of like
headlock,
taunting him. I was just being really mean, and he was just sort of flinching. And I just felt,
this is a very different podcast.
Do you think that's what he does when he listens to this? He starts flinching. He's like, oh,
yeah, which he does all the time. And he's just like, oh, guys, that was a bit mean. I'm trying here. It's very difficult. Yeah, it's weird because I don't bully people. But in my dream, I was bullying Sunak. Ros, when Sunak was asked to cite one of Cameron's foreign policy achievements as PM back in November, he could only name hosting the G8 summit in 2013. Did you come away from Cameron's term with much of a sense of a foreign policy philosophy? And do you see that the continuity there? Like, what is his view of, Britain in the world?
I think Sunak could probably think of some other things about David Cameron's foreign policy legacy, but he didn't want to discuss them very much. In terms of philosophy, I don't think he does philosophy, David Cameron. He's not a philosophical guy. I think he has a vague vision of Britain and the world trading a lot and somehow being a force for good, and it doesn't really go much further than that. It's interesting to look back on 2010 to 2016, though, because if you ask what was that period like, because we don't think about it very much, there was a kind of a feeling that Britain still had a role to play in the world, but it should not involve boots on the ground, right? Because we saw how that ended, didn't end, but in Iraq and Afghanistan. So there was a feeling that there was still things we could do, but not soldiers on the ground. And there was also a feeling that we could do some good through aid, which is why the coalition put in that 0.7% of GDP thing, which has now essentially been abandoned, which was supposed to enhance Britain's reputation as a force for good. But in terms of what actually happened, of course, there was Libya, which we'll talk about in a bit. And then there was the whole issue of strikes against Islamic State in Syria, which Cameron found very difficult to get through the Commons. And it was ages. He really struggled. And he was still very secretive about them. We still don't know the full details of what was discussed around those strikes, because he wouldn't release all the information to the Intelligence and Security Committee, or rather the Intelligence and Security Committee were told to redact it. And as a result, there's a lot of it's unclear what all his thinking was at that time.
It's funny because every time Tony Blair opens his mouth, people shout Iraq. I'm not so sure about Cameron and Libya. A Foreign Affairs Select Committee report criticised his decision to intervene in 2011 as not being based on accurate intelligence and found that he did not have a coherent strategy, which I think we could tell. How much of this has stuck to him in his new role? I don't hear people, flinging that at him.
No, surprisingly little is stuck. And that's because it's not a part of the story we tell ourselves about the last 15 years or so of British politics. It has fallen out of public view.
Maybe if you destroy the public realm and take us out of the EU, people just forget about intervention.
Well, I think they have done. And it should be remembered because it was very consequential. Libya is not in a good way. I mean, toppling Gaddafi, which was what we helped to do, and we played a major role in doing that. And Obama was also very keen on it, to be fair, although he's later said that he acknowledged that there were definitely problems with it, and he also had to go at Cameron for, as he put it, losing concentration and not really keeping on the task. But what we see happening in Libya now, and what we see happening more widely in Africa, is pretty much a disaster. I mean, the rebels that we ended up effectively supporting by getting rid of Gaddafi had an Islamist element, which we didn't want. The case for intervention, as the Foreign Affairs Select Committee said, was arguably very much overstated. We made the same mistake as we did in Iraq, in Libya. And there were some terrible floods last year in Libya as well, which didn't help matters. But what we see now is the Wagner Group, which, Prigozhin, all that. Now, basically, the Wagner Group is now an arm of the Russian state, now that Prigozhin has been got rid of. Going around Africa saying, we will secure your dodgy regime and keep you in power, providing you let us have access to natural resources, and so you can exploit them and give us some of the profits. It is in a bad, bad place.
Yasmeen, Cameron was a supporter of Israel, really unsurprisingly, but he did also make comments like calling Gaza a prison camp, criticising certain past Israeli military interventions. And recently he stepped up criticism of Israel before Starmer did. How much credibility do you think he has on the world stage on this issue?
I mean, the way I interpret it is kind of going back to what we were discussing with regard to the fact that he's been prime minister and almost kind of a separate entity from this government, even though he's obviously very much part of it, holding one of the most senior offices of the state. So, I mean, it's probably easier, I would imagine, for Sunak to have him saying some of the hard truths to a friend rather than having to do it himself. Biden has Blinken, but he also kind of has to do a lot of that himself. Sunak, I feel like not that I kind of follow his every sort of waking moment and everything he says, but I feel like I haven't heard him make as many interventions on this issue in that way, in the way that Cameron has. And yeah, I mean, I think also, Cameron has the added advantage of if he knows he's in this for a limited time and, as we were saying, wants to have an impact, he can say those things. He can say things like, coming out with that comment about the UK potentially recognizing a Palestinian state. Now, I imagine he won't do anything totally untoward because, to the point that we made earlier, not to completely piss off number 10. However, this is not a man who has to worry about losing a seat in the next election, just about making an impact now. And with 2 wars going on, one in Europe, one in the Middle East, this is the time to do it.
Last week, he urged the US Congress to pass a bill including support for Ukraine, which has been held up by all manner of chicanery and fuckery. And he brought up the spectre of appeasing Hitler. Republican lunatic Marjorie Taylor Greene responded, David Cameron needs to worry about his own country, and frankly, he can kiss my ass. Now, she's a live wire. Do you think that's a common view? Was that sort of that piece in The Hill, was that misjudged because just Americans in general just don't want a posh Brit telling them what to do?
I mean, he clearly decided to go for The Hill to reach that target audience, right? Funnily enough, this isn't actually the first time that Marjorie Taylor Greene has told off a Brit for poking their nose, I guess, into what she thinks they have no business doing. I don't know if you remember in 2022, I think Channel 4's Siobhan Kennedy had asked her about gun laws. And she told her to go back to your own country and worry about your no gun laws. You have all kinds of murder, she said.
Wow.
I don't know what anyway, so David Cameron shouldn't feel too bad because not the first, probably not the last, but she's told to go back to where you came from. I don't necessarily think it's a common view, though, if only because I don't actually think a lot of Americans are necessarily paying much attention to what David Cameron has to say. I think Americans, to the extent that they are aware of how the world sees the holdup of aid to Ukraine, recognize that there's a lot of criticism, particularly from America's European partners. That's not unusual.
Republicans' resistance to helping Ukraine is a taste of US isolationism if Trump were to be re-elected. Trump recently seemed to give Putin the thumbs up to invade any country he fancied because the other NATO members weren't paying enough. I mean, it's a sort of a big topic, but like, how did the party of Eisenhower, Nixon, and Reagan just sort of give up on the rest of the world? Because it's not just Trump, it's the whole party, it seems.
Yeah. I mean, Trump's taken over the party effectively, and for all intents and purposes will continue to do so unless Nikki Haley makes a surprise recovery. But there is a history of isolationism in the U.S., but you have to go pretty far back to,
right,
after World War I, this kind of idea that, America doesn't need to entangle ourselves in world affairs, that we are geographically isolated, and therefore, the wars that happen, we don't necessarily need to be a part of them. To the point that you made, it wasn't really until Eisenhower that this sort of belief in this idea that actually America's partnerships, America's relationships make America stronger, richer, that's a good thing. And that kind of, when that belief sort of held through all Republican presidents until the most recent one. But that isolationist sort of strain didn't die off completely. And I think that the resurgence that we're seeing with Trump, that's why we're seeing it. But I think what's different about Trump than, say, Senator Taft, I think a lot of people kind of point to him as sort of this example of isolationism, is that Trump doesn't seem to do it because of this belief. Like, I don't think he has some sort of like philosophical belief in the big government is bad and America's bad. Like, I think he more sees it because he's like, if it's not benefiting me, then why? Then who cares?
It's very much like he sees it like a protection racket, doesn't he? It's like, well, if you don't pay me, then I let the bad Russian man beat you up.
Right. And if the strong men that I look up to and admire don't like these things, then I don't like these things.
Yeah, it's worth remembering that in Trump's first term, and hopefully the only one, the America First thing. I mean, that slogan actually came from the early 1940s, late 1930s, pro-appeasement, slightly pro-fascist, isolationist movement in America. So I mean, there's actually that strain goes all over.
Ku Klux Klan were very into that.
Yeah. So what's interesting, I think, in terms of particularly the NATO thing, and this point about Trump basically seeing everything in this quasi kind of mafioso view of basically, if a negotiation involves both parties feeling satisfied, then I've probably been ripped off.
Yeah.
Everything is a zero-sum game, both in trade and in diplomacy, and that's actually that's a very Kremlin-y way of looking at the world. That's exactly why Putin, he doesn't just hate NATO because he sees that as a sort of a territorial aggression or a territorial offense against a greater Russia. He really hates the EU as well because everything has to be done on those zero-sum terms. And ideally, you'd have big powers, that see each other from on high, and then essentially crappy little countries that belong to one or the other blocks and do what they're told. And this idea, which is central to all of the European architecture of the post-war era, that the little countries can aggregate and amplify their power and achieve something, peace and prosperity, through sort of communal action, which is also in America's interest, as was just said. That is so alien to the way Trump looks at the world.
Well, talking of the EU, you wrote in The Guardian the other day that Europe sort of has to develop a plan B for security, without American help, even if Biden beats Trump in November, because that's obviously where the Republican Party is going, and they can still block things in Congress. Do you think Cameron gets that? And having basically supplied Brexiters with the petrol to burn bridges to Europe, is he trying to rebuild any?
I think he would like to. I'm very reliably told by someone who's had conversations with the right people that Cameron, until he actually got back into government and arrived at the Foreign Office, had not fully comprehended quite how rubbish the Brexit deal that Boris Johnson and David Frost did was. It's only when you see it in operation in government and you think, where are the levers that I can pull to try and rebuild some kind of European diplomacy? Think, wow, they're not here, and under the bonnet all the wires have been cut and there is absolutely nothing. So I think my sense is that he would be slightly frustrated with that, but also just the politics of sort of rebuilding the kind of diplomatic relations you'd need look, it's something that we've discussed on this podcast many times before. Big picture, what is Britain's strategic offer to the European project, right? At some level, it's, you could do a defence and security pact, and but a lot of that's going to be bilateral stuff with France, which is the other big military power. You still have to talk about, you still then get into all the other questions of trade alignment, because there's all sorts of defence procurement issues. You've just very quickly get back into that vortex of, wow, Brexit was a massive mistake. How on earth are we going to sort of unpack it? And I don't see him having the license or the time or the energy to get into that particular box.
Finally, Ros, in history books, I found that it's totally normal to say that somebody was right about some things and wrong about others, and to acknowledge the difference between different phases of a career. Obviously, if you're reading, Cameron is perhaps not a Churchillian figure, but if you're reading Churchill, like his bad patches were very, very bad, and we're allowed to sort of accept that the career sort of ebb and flow. Is that harder to do in real time? Is it, because I'm sure that some people listening to this will be quite annoyed by the fact that it's not that we've showered him in praise, but to sort of say anything nice about Cameron in this separate phase of his career in a different job is to somehow whitewash his sort of sins as Prime Minister. So I wondered, do you feel any differently towards him?
No. I think what we're seeing with Cameron is a degree of basic competence in the job, which is a relief after what we've been through in the last few years, right? We should note that he's not getting very much scrutiny, actually, because he's in the Lords. He doesn't appear in the Commons, and that means that as you said, he's kind of freewheeling about and doing his own thing. But all the same, he's not making the weather. He's not really taking a lead on Gaza. He's playing it very safe in that. I think this role plays to Cameron's strengths, which are that he's a networker and an opportunist, and he's great at sort of short-term diplomacy, and he has very little long-term judgment, but he doesn't need really long-term judgment because he's only going to be in the job for another, I don't know, let's say 8 months. He doesn't see problems coming down the road. And that's partly because he's the kind of man, due to his background, for whom problems coming down the road are always coming down the road towards someone else and not him. I see a man trying to rehabilitate his reputation and doing it quite successfully, but I don't think it will be more than a paragraph at the end of Wikipedia, right? I don't think we're talking a whole section.
There's something recalled one thing, actually, weirdly, in Cameron's defence, and I haven't said much in Cameron's defence in my entire life, but actually, if you remember, when he was in opposition, leader of the opposition, I think 2008, when there was a Russian intervention in Abkhazia and Georgia, he called it, actually, he said something very hawkish about Russia and Putin, and then ended up having to sort of wind his neck back in, because in those days, everyone said, that's ludicrous, preposterous, you're just the opposition leader, you have no idea what you're playing with here, you can't go saying those sorts of things about Russia, it's a bit more complex than that. And actually, looking back, he was right.
He's a really useful person to have in the cabinet to de-escalate tensions with China, because he has such good business links with China. And given that there are quite a few hawks in the cabinet and we don't want things really kicking off, in that sense, I think that's the main reason he's there, to be honest.
Now, let's have a question for one of our Patreon backers in But Your Emails. If you support us on Patreon, you can also submit a question for the panel, and there's a But Your Emails special coming next week where we can answer some of the dozens of questions we haven't been able to fit into the main show. For this week, Patreon backer Sarah B says, given that every time I hear a Tory, they're warning us about the dangers of going back to square one, where does the panel actually think this point in time is? Yasmeen, they're very keen on this slogan. What do you think they mean?
Because I'm an American, I love to preface sentences with that. And I first came to this country in 2017, which was just before Brexit was about to kick off in earnest. So when I think of like the chapters of like kind of UK conservative governance, which is all I've ever known, I kind of think of that Theresa May period, the Boris period, and then, gosh, how many prime ministers we have in between? Truss, Sunak. So when they say back to square one, it's hard because this is one conservative government, technically, very different phases. But I would imagine, but at no point do you really want to go back to the Theresa May one, because that was kind of seemingly shambolic. And then you certainly don't want to go back to Boris, because even though Brexit got done, then there was all the COVID. So I really don't actually know. And then Liz Truss was kind of a blip. It's not long enough to go back to. So I don't.
Square.
Yeah. So I don't actually really know where on the, if this were some sort of like board game, what square you would be going to.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, Raf, we ended with, I mean, the last new Labour government, that ended obviously with the aftermath of the financial crisis. So I suppose one could say, let's not go back to the financial crisis might be something. That's literally the only interpretation I can think of, because actually so many things have got a lot worse under this government. So it seems almost like don't let Labour ruin it kind of message. What could Labour ruin?
Yeah, I don't think there is a way of interpreting that slogan that reflects well on the government. I think it expresses this strange idea that Rishi Sunak has acquired, and you can understand why he's got it, that you somehow get to become prime minister and pretend that this is an entirely new administration and all the mistakes that Liz Truss made are nothing to do with you and all the mistakes that Boris Johnson made are nothing to do with you. So I suppose that what he's sort of got in his head is this idea that he and Jeremy Hunt are clearing up the mess that was made by waves hands vaguely at the past in a sort of incoherent way, and that's what, you know, and that so they've generated stability over what, like 18 months or something, and that's what Labour would mess up. I mean, the reality is obviously it's all Conservative government, and I think you're right that conceptually, probably if you wanted to think about a square one to make a coherent argument about the recent past, it is that 2008, 2009 point, isn't it? Because that's when we were all saying, you know, and there was this great wider policy debate, like the whole system has gone bang. You know, nothing can be the same again. We can't possibly go on like this. We have to totally reimagine the way we do political economy. And then we just completely carried on. You know, we did this sort of pro-cyclical fiscal policy. You got, you know, the coalition government that really didn't actually examine any of the things that needed examining about the way Britain is governed and the way the economy is run. So yeah, I'd say Lehman probably square one.
Ros.
This is a slogan that just makes no sense to me, and it blows my mind why he keeps using it. I have thought about a number of different options, and yet none of them, as Raf says, reflect well on the Conservative Party.
Because even that one, even like 2010, you know, and obviously that New Labour did not end well, but you still say, like, well, we didn't have austerity, we had a lot more things were open, and we didn't have Brexit.
You didn't have to wait more than 4 hours to get seen in A&E.
Yeah.
I mean, people remember that stuff, right?
Maybe it was when, you know, Brexit really looked like it was in serious trouble, and and Boris Johnson prorogued Parliament. Maybe that was square one. Maybe that it's like in when the French have, you know, different republics and so on. And when we came back after that was square one. I don't know. It just I'm sorry. It just there's too much.
Well, perhaps regular listener Rishi Sunak can email us and tell us where square one is, because we literally don't know.
Yeah.
Next up, Ros has a book out this week about, and indeed called, The Future of Trust. Congratulations, Ros.
Thank you.
So it's quite a short book, but you did go sort of deep on the concept and actually what we mean by it.
Yeah, what do we mean by it? I still don't really know, to be honest. I've been thinking about it for ages and I'm still confused because it's just such a hard concept to unpack. You cannot really explain in any rational way why you trust someone or not, or don't trust something. As soon as you actually start to analyse what's involved in it, it falls apart. And so you can have endless surveys, and we do, about how much on a 10-point scale you trust the NHS or Rishi Sunak or Parliament or a bank. But it doesn't actually get you very far, because where do you go next? It's a very, very slippery concept. And that's one of the reasons why it was so fascinating. But I don't feel I've even got to the bottom of it yet.
I find you start with a dictionary definition.
Yeah, I did. And you know, it goes right back to, you know, it's in the Bible in quite an interesting way, where the Bible says you shouldn't trust in worldly leaders. You should only trust God, right? Because worldly leaders, they're like a stick that if you lean on it, it will break. And that, of course, is the expression of a religion that wants you to believe in it and not somebody, a worldly leader or some sort of passing king. But it's nonetheless interesting as early on an example of how you really should be quite mistrustful of people who tell you that you should trust them.
So you write about interpersonal trust and institutional trust, and that people with lower levels of interpersonal trust are less likely to vote for the news, to participate in democracy. Essentially, do these things always go in in tandem? Or is it a more complicated
No,
relationship?
it's much more. It's more complicated than that. So people with low levels of institutional trust are also less likely to vote as well. But they are very, very different things. We can have interpersonal trust and experience that with people we've never met. I mean, generally we have it with circles of friends and relatives and so on. But it can extend as far as a leader. And of course, that's often the way politics works. Politics isn't always about institutional trust. Quite often, when it comes to voting day, it's about interpersonal trust. It's, do I trust Rishi Sunak more, or do I trust Keir Starmer more? And that's one of the most fascinating things about it. But the thing about modern society, and increasingly so, more so every single year, is that you need more and more institutional trust, because you are effectively having to delegate more and more of your life to institutions whose workings you do not understand. So that can involve getting on a plane, it can involve banking, it can involve, getting on a bus and using a smart card. There are countless ways in daily life in which we have to rely on this institutional trust, and that's why it's so important.
So, okay, what factors are eroding it now? Because there has been, I mean, from a different angle, something I was researching, you just see this kind of like plummeting levels of trust, particularly in government. Sort of started in the 70s, this massive decline.
All the surveys are down. You never see a survey that says, oh, people trust this more than they used to. It is always down, down, down. Although there are certain things like business that people do trust more, perhaps, than it deserves, and certainly more than other kinds of institution, which is an interesting question in itself. But what erodes institutional trust? Well, I mean, in Britain especially, you can see the institutions crumbling around you. And it's not just, obviously, the NHS. Although we have, are urged to put our ultimate trust in the state, in the UK, in the NHS, and you saw that during the pandemic, it is the ultimate expression of Britain's trust in their state and their leadership, but also in things like the courts and the way the law works, and who gets prosecuted for crimes and who doesn't, and who gets away with it, and who can afford to go to court, and who has not a hope of getting their case heard. It is all around us, because these institutions have been eroded, because it's quite easy often to erode them without people necessarily noticing in the early stages.
And how do we compare to other countries? I mean, America is not
no, they're not great
doused
either.
in trust either.
No, but then America has fewer state institutions in which it has always tended to put its trust. Of course, it's never had an NHS. There's Medicare and so on, but it's never had anything like the same thing. So there has always been a greater suspicion in America of state power. And so I suppose in a way that means that when institutional trust in America breaks down, it's even more serious, because you've got, but things like the Supreme Court are very much distrusted, much more so than they used to be.
Just in that. Yeah. Is it one of those annoying cases where it turns out that, like, Denmark or whatever?
Yeah, totally.
Everyone
Denmark
trusts
and Finland. Yeah, I interviewed an academic a couple of years ago from Denmark, and he had this very, very interesting theory as to why Danes trust their state more, which I won't go into because it's quite complicated. But essentially, yes, it is countries that make a clear offering to their citizens about what they are going to do for them, and generally follow through on that. That is what is not happening in the UK at the moment.
Sounds simple when you put it like that. Raf, why has trust in Parliament collapsed so bad? It's halved over the last 3 decades. 1 in 5 people in the UK, in one poll, have confidence in Parliament.
Yeah, I think there's a number of different things, isn't it? Cultural and just political events. I think a general decline in deference is important. I think a lot of the trust that you might previously had in Parliament, if you go back to sort of Profumo scandal, some of those are just misplaced. People thought, these are fine chaps who know what they're doing, we trust them, and that was a mistake. They were probably just as stupid, venal and self-serving as they are now. So that that might be a healthy downgrading in trust. But obviously, the expenses scandal was pivotal, wasn't it? I mean, that was a point where a lot of people just looked up and went, hang on a second, we've had this unconsidered assumption that there are certain codes and norms and ways of behaving that govern politics. And you bought a duck island? What even is that? You start flipping mortgages. Do you remember all of that stuff? I mean,
I knew you'd say the Duck Island. That was all I can remember
it was
from that.
colossal. And so that was very important. Then I think you pile onto that the financial crisis, where the entire sort of political economic establishment had not seen something coming, and then the transfer of wealth essentially from poor people to rich people through the bankers by bailing out the banks looked like an enormous betrayal of what public policy is supposed to do.
Because that was a case where actually there was way too much trust in the banks, and it was like, I'm sure they know what they're doing with collateralized debt obligations.
And when something like that happens, I think the elected officers get some of the flack, and justifiably. And then pile onto that Brexit, and that was very interesting, because I think you had a situation where Leavers could accuse Remainers of thwarting Brexit in Parliament. So because Brexit was so, I mean, gosh, we talked about this so many times in this podcast, let's not relitigate it, but they tried to do something that wasn't possible. It was they promised alchemy, and obviously it couldn't be delivered, and Parliament sort of put up its hand and said,
just spray painted lead,
wasn't it?
You can't
do this. Yeah. And obviously then, so it made sense rationally, if you're a Leaver, to blame Parliament for pointing out the reality of how hard it was. And also there were lots of people in Parliament who genuinely did want to stop Brexit. So, and people had voted for it. So that was, added another colossal level of mistrust. And Parliament was literally failing to solve. It was the stasis, the deadlock, whichever side you were on was enormously frustrating, and made it look like Parliament wasn't functioning as an institution. Parliament blew it with the indicative votes and all those things as well. And then finally, I think the important thing, and this is another broader cultural point, I think the technology and the internet promotes, and social media promotes, a sense of instant gratification, the kind of constant rolling referendum of Twitter and other things, where you basically get to express what you want, and or if you in any retail purchase you click, it arrives the next day. And representative politics through Parliament is so clunky and analog and takes ages, and the legislative process, it doesn't deliver like that. That's not how democracy works. Democracy, you vote, some people get in, they're allowed to get things a bit wrong, make some mistakes, and it's only 4 or 5 years later they can turn around and go, did we broadly get it right? If so, vote us back in. That's a really analog way of doing things. Yeah. I think people culturally that's not where we are.
And that's one of the reasons why businesses are more trusted now, because you have this relationship which, is embedded in law, where if in quite many instances where if a business rips you off, you have some recourse. And that, of course, does not happen in democratic politics. But this is one of the interesting paradoxes of trust, because you'd think that trust would increase with greater scrutiny, but often that is not the case. Often you just don't want to know. And a good example would be a plane, right? Do you want to look inside the engine before you take off? No, you actually want somebody else who's qualified to look at an engine and know whether it's going wrong or not, to look at the engine and see whether it's working. But what the internet allows, and the parliamentary expenses scandal was another example, is immense scrutiny of public institutions and what's going on inside them. And that opens them up to degrees of criticism which they have never had before.
Yasmeen, I think you could say the same about the media, and you write for Time, which is used to be the magazine. I'm not knocking it, but it used to be the magazine of record. Like when I'm researching a book, so often what I'm going back to is the Time archive. It's almost like, well, what did the world think about this event? And trust in all manner of media institutions, certainly in Britain and America and I'm sure many other countries, has gone down. And how and I don't think personally, as a journalist, maybe biased, but I don't think that's because journalists have become sneakier and are sort of less trustworthy. So, I mean, how's journalism responding to that? And is it limited what you can do if you have leaders like Trump out there going fake news, lying media?
Yeah, I mean, it certainly doesn't help when you have world leaders, politicians, loudmouth YouTuber talking about how, basically lambasting the media and saying it's inherently, distrusted. And look, I'm not saying that the media is perfect. I think certainly with the advent of the internet, I think it added complications there too. There's this, things like fact checking and getting things right. And also there's just like the sheer quantity of news and choice that you have. That all adds layers of complexity. I think certainly from like a UK and US vantage point, I think partisan media, I imagine kind of for as long as I kind of remember, has always been a thing. People have always had their, I prefer to watch Fox News over CNN or MSNBC or whatever. But I think it's become different in that suddenly it's not just a matter of disagreement, but it's like this abject, like, no, they've got it wrong. Like that they're completely misleading us. And so there's definitely the polarization aspect that hasn't helped. But I think also media is kind of wrangling with, certainly, when I think of kind of modern day criticisms that I even see, like, some of my peers make about the type of language that we use. And certainly how, like, even the most best in well-intentioned institutions, like say the BBC, particularly with like kind of a lot of like the events happening these days, like even if we just take the war in Gaza as an example, someone dies versus someone's killed, things like that. I mean, even those little things erode a lot of trust in, like, are these publications speaking to me? Are they representing me? Are they giving me the facts? And I think that's something that media institutions are going to have to kind of actively think about. And doing that whilst they're also competing for readers and eyeballs, because people also have a lot more that they can do with their time.
Because
than
with
just read it.
it's that kind of clickbait urge and grabbing people is sort of antithetical to the trust building. And quite often I'll see people on Twitter denouncing a headline on a paywalled site, and I happen to have paid the subscription so I can read the article, and I'm like, oh, that's not really what the article is saying at all. And somebody probably thought they were quite clever getting attention by kind of slightly caricaturing the argument, and yet this just leaves the majority of people who don't have a subscription thinking, well, this looks like a load of old trash.
But so thinking about trust in institutions again, it is an obvious aim of this government to reduce trust in the BBC. It ideologically is opposed to the licence fee, or at least many MPs are. What more widely than that, it would like to see a freer market as it sees it in news and the supply of news and comment. And what we've seen, and particularly in the last 2 years with GB News and the extraordinary revolving door between serving politicians and presenters on GB News, is an attempt to build up a rival to the BBC that spends quite a lot of its time slagging off the BBC and perpetrating the idea that the BBC is not to be trusted. And of course, it's not just from the right. The left has also done a great job of attacking the BBC in its time as well. It's a game anyone can play.
I'm not a regular GB News viewer, but I have noticed that some of its reporting is less reliable than that of the BBC. And that, for example, you get, Neil Oliver saying that vaccines cause turbo cancer, and you get a bunch of conspiracy theorists. And one of the weird things about conspiracy theorists is that they have this weird mix of like immense skepticism of any mainstream narrative. Any mainstream narrative is immediately suspect. And then unbelievable credulity about like a kind of yoga teacher on Facebook. It's like anyone who isn't in the mainstream media is probably right. And we've seen a sort of that weirdness in where you place your trust in terms of like Brexit. Most people didn't really know what Brexit was. I know that was meant to be a condescending thing to say, but it was obviously true.
Yeah.
And
Absolutely.
yeah, they just went, I guess I trust these people. I trust Nigel Farage and I trust Boris Johnson. And in America, there's a lot of people that sort of trust Donald Trump. And it's very strange that you can understand somebody like, that's a more old school smarm of David Cameron. It's like, hello, I'm a posh man and I'm in charge. And that's something where you just think, I can see why someone would trust him, even if they shouldn't. Whereas some of these guys, they come along and they just seem like, well, clearly, would you lend Donald Trump money? No.
No, but that doesn't necessarily matter. There are plenty of people who you might want to trust who you don't want to lend money to. Trust operates on multiple different levels. When you think about Brexit offered an amazing cognitive shortcut. I actually think the genius of Brexit was the very word Brexit itself. The idea that with a clean break, you could remove yourself from a myriad of laws and institutions. And they managed to sell that idea because it was appealing to think that something that most people had not really thought about much before. Let's face it, the European Union was not widely discussed except as the source of some laws that quite often people found slightly annoying. But to suggest that with one clean break, as they were always saying, you could exit all that and set out alone and free yourself, that was the great sell of Brexit, and that was what people were putting their trust in.
And the genius of Boris Johnson was that, speaking to your point about who and why people trust certain propositions, is that he somehow combined all the received generations of reassurance that you get from what the British establishment has always been, sounding posh, having been to Eton and Oxford, and all these things that sort of imply nothing will really change. It's always going to be exactly how it was. How bad could it really be? It's all a bit of a game, with the adventure in the sense that this is actually hilarious and funny, and we can just smash everything up and it'll all be a terribly entertaining jape. And by combining those two things, the sort of thrill of vandalism and the deep reassurance of poshness, I don't think there's might not be anyone in the entire country who could have combined those things as well as he did at that moment.
It's like when you talk about different kinds of trust, there's trusting somebody to look after something, to look after the NHS or the economy. And then I suppose there's trusting somebody to smash up the thing that you don't like. And often they will do that. Your trust was well placed because they will smash it up. It's just you might not be left in a good place afterwards.
Yeah, well, I mean, another of the great things they managed with Brexit was because it seemed such a simple proposition. As we began to try to leave, it became obvious that it was actually a very complicated proposition. And that gave more ammunition, ironically, to leave. Because it's all so complicated, you don't understand it. Why should you trust something that you don't understand? Became the reflex. And there was just like, oh, for God's sake, just take all this stuff away. And that's why oven-ready Brexit. Oven-ready Brexit became a thing.
You said something really interesting there, which I agree with. And I think it's a sort of a cognitive mistake that a lot of us made, before 2016 Brexit Trump, which was to think that there are all sorts of signs and signals that you can look at and think, oh, this reassures me that this information, this thing is good. So the masthead on a broadsheet newspaper, for example, or things that you look at and go, okay, this is telling me, these are cues that tell me that this is reliable information. And it turns out those are culturally much more rarefied than I think a lot of us realized. And actually a lot of people found those cues alienating, and they had become the emblem of mistrust and something that looked to us like trash tabloid. Why would you possibly trust this person's basically appallingly vulgar on YouTube and clearly is not an expert and I don't trust him. That was cutting through in exactly the way that essentially for want of a better term, the old metropolitan liberal elite was not prepared to rebut and didn't know how to engage with properly.
Well, Ros's book is out now. It covers all these things, plus the serious future stuff like AI and metaverse, and a frankly demented sounding sort of snake-shaped city that they're thinking of building in Saudi Arabia, which I thought perhaps Ros had made up as a sci-fi jape, but appears to be a real plan.
It totally is. You can go to the internet and find all about what it's going to look like. Yeah, The Line is a brainchild of MBS, the Mohammed bin Salman in Saudi Arabia. And it is an extraordinary thing because it's going to be a paradise of surveillance, basically. You are going to walk around, you're going to have a smartwatch. It's going to tell you when you're at risk of suffering from anything. The healthcare is going to be fantastic. There is not a detail on the website of how this place is going to be governed or whether there is any element of democracy in it. There isn't, by the way. It is a surveillance state par excellence. And one of the things that I speculate about in the book is whether, as states like ours struggle and public services break down, places like this might have, despite the lack of democracy and the lack of accountability and the fact that you're living in a scary state, might have a surprisingly strong appeal for many people.
Soylent Green, yum.
We've reached the end of the show. So what are the stories that have gone under the radar this week? Yasmeen.
So there was on Monday, well, this was a story that actually predates a few weeks, but basically for backstory, an Israeli lawmaker with the Arab Jewish party, Hadash, called Ofer Kasif, faced a vote of impeachment, basically being threatened to get kicked out of the Knesset over his support for South Africa's genocide case at the ICJ. That vote, unprecedented, hasn't happened before, happened on Monday. And typically the mechanism that was used to hold this vote is if they've said something racist or incited violence against the state of Israel. Even the deputy attorney general of the government said there is no legal standing for this. So what happened on Monday is this vote took place. It needed 90 of the Knesset's 120 lawmakers to vote for it to pass. 86 voted to impeach him. So he has saved his job by just 4 votes. Now that's good news for him. However, when I spoke with him after the vote on Monday, he said, yes, but the fact that that many voted to impeach a lawmaker on the basis of his opinion is quite concerning for Israeli democracy. So yeah, that was a story that happened on Monday. And I think given everything going on in the world, it kind of went under the radar. Had he been impeached, I think people would have seen it.
Well, obviously the world is focused on what's happening in Gaza, but the sort of growing authoritarianism of Israel, and when you delve into some of the characters that are in the cabinet, is incredibly alarming for Israeli citizens as well.
There's a pretty considerable war on dissent, and the fact that it's reached the Knesset, I think, is really concerning.
Raf?
I'm kind of looking for good news in the world right now, and it's not that easy to come by, but I was quite thrilled by the discovery of altomagnetism. Are you familiar with altomagnetism?
No.
This is a new kind of magnetism, right? Who knew that there was more than one?
Is it like alternative truth?
There basically, turns out there are 3 kinds of magnetism. So there's the classic one that you know about, like, fridge magnets and, what be stuff that blew our minds as kids. And
the second one is sexual.
Yeah, this is like the kind of charisma that's radiating in this room right now. No, then there's basically the non-ferromagnetism, which is rubbish and doesn't really do much. Actually, it's incredibly important in all sorts of ways of physics that don't really understand. And then there's this, they've found this third one, and which again, also incredibly complicated, don't really understand. It's all about the way each atom has its electrons whizzing around, the core, and those whiz around in certain directions in different ways that basically generate their own little magnetic fields, and then aggregated together, they make the bigger magnetic field. And altomagnetism has this crazy, wacky, new type of magnetic field, which is going to be incredibly useful and important and save the world, maybe. But either way, just reading about it, I don't know, I just remember, it's like, magnetism is cool. Like, do you remember? Like, how does it even work? Yeah. It's wild. It's like do you remember when you were a kid, you get what looks like an ordinary lump of metal, and it sticks to stuff, or you get the same poles, north, and they repel each other, and it's magic. It feels like magic. It's like it's like a weird superpower. And just reading about the new kind of magnetism, I was momentarily taken back to that thing, being a child, thinking, cool magnetism. And so I just wanted to share that with listeners to the podcast.
Well, Ralph has taken us all the way up. Where are you taking us, Ros?
How can I follow that? You do realise I want to talk about a young offenders institution now, albeit very briefly, okay? Okay. This is a report that came out, an independent report into Cookham Wood, which is a young offenders institution in Kent. Came out last week, and it's terrible. It makes just awful, awful reading. So this is a place that houses 15 to 18-year-olds. Often, many of them are on remand for horrible crimes or convicted of horrible crimes. And they are, undoubtedly difficult and difficult kids. These are often people who've stabbed other people. It's not great. They're all boys. But the measure of our society is how we treat these kids, right? It is a measure of whether we treat them with humanity despite them being extremely, extremely difficult people. And they are being treated in a way that the report describes as inhumane. And the report repeats that word several times in the course of it. Some of them are held in cells for up to 23 hours a day. They get a maximum of 12 hours of schooling a week if they're lucky. It is just an awful, and when I say 23 hours a day, that's solitary confinement. And some of them went for over 100 days with solitary confinement in that way. Absolutely awful.
Well, mine is sort of good news from extremely bad news. Just one of the most shocking things that happened to anybody that I knew in the last few years was Meredith Mills and Paul Leahy, both editors on The Guardian, who I had written for and had some dealings with. Their 13-year-old daughter, Martha, died of sepsis after an accident in 2021. It was very preventable. She should have been taken to intensive care earlier, and she wasn't. And they've been campaigning something which is now called Martha's Rule, where patients and family can call a critical care team for a second opinion if the condition is deteriorating and the primary care team isn't doing enough. It's being rolled out, starting with 100 hospitals. I've seen a little bit of skepticism from some doctors, but something like this has been tried, I think, in Canada and Australia, and it's worked well. And what they found is that people, people do use it wisely, and there's not loads of just kind of like super anxious nuisance patients calling for this. You know, it really is when something, a second opinion is really needed. And it just seems to be one of those cases where just like this horrifying personal tragedy might end up having this kind of life-saving legacy. And that's the show. Thanks to Raf.
Thank you.
Yasmeen.
Thanks.
And Ros.
Thank you.
Stick around for the extra bit after Demon is a Monster by Corner Shop and a roll call of our generous supporters. You could join them, get the podcast early and without ads, plus lots more. Search Oh God What Now Patreon to find out how.